Well, I run a subject called BMS 317, and it's a pathophysiology subject, but it's an applied patho. So they learn about all the disease processes in the body, but they also learn about, so what does that mean for me as a paramedic? What am I supposed to know about it and then do about it? So we combine that with treatment. So of course, they're all excited about the treatment. They love that. They love going in the sim lab, and they love practicing on real patients, but they cannot stand sitting down and looking at a textbook and actually learning the diseases, because that's boring. So one of my goals in my tutorials was try to make that a little bit more interesting. I have an internal group, and I also this year inherited a distance cohort, and that was an extra task, a challenge for me, as for those of you who have distance, trying to engage the distance cohort is challenging. And our distance students are actually working paramedics who have a diploma and are now going on to get a degree. So they're already experienced paramedics, so they're a little bit different kind of group to engage. So I had that challenge of how do I create a tutorial that can be useful for both groups. And I also wanted to increase the perceived relevance for practice. So the big diseases, heart attacks, strokes, we talk about that in class, we do it in the sim lab, that's obvious. But when you talk about things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and Bell's palsy, some of these things, the students are like, I don't know if that's really relevant to me or how I would apply that knowledge. So I had that in the back of my mind, is how could I actually show them that this is something that they can use. I also wanted to facilitate collaboration. When they're in the sim lab in a group with their paramedic partners, that makes sense to them. They know how to collaborate. But I wanted to also, and they'll always be working with people who are more or less experienced with them. And that, of course, is represented in our classrooms, isn't it? We have those students that are the strong students and the ones that maybe aren't as strong or aren't as good academically, but have more hands-on practice or hands-on skills. So it was a way to try to maximize, I guess, the different ends of the spectrum within the activities, which again, we always do. So what did I do? On my Interact site, I created a link, a web link to the tutorial sign-in. So you'll see there, this is off my Interact site. And this is just a screen capture that I did with that snippet tool, just again to show you how easily it is to do that. And you can highlight things on that. So I created an Adobe Connect meeting, and on my Interact site, I put a link to it. And then I used the classroom next door to run the tutorial. So this beginning part takes a fair bit of work. When you go into the classroom, you have to get all the computers set up and logged onto. And the students need to, when they come into the classroom, they need to be organized into their groups, which is why structurally it's set up this way. And I organized them into groups of 5 or 6. So I limited how many chairs were at each table, so I knew how many groups there would be. And each team had to have one person log into their Interact site and click on here. So that's what they did. They got at their tables in groups. I told them to bring their books, bring their computers, bring your phones, whatever you might need, log in, click on that link. So that was really, so when the one person in their group clicked on that link, it took them to the Adobe Connect meeting, and anyone who's done Adobe Connect, this is all familiar to you. They just log in as a guest, and they all came up with team names, which was the first fun thing they did. Of course, it's amazing how creative they can be when they think they're going to be anonymous there for a minute. Once they log into the Adobe Connect, and for those of you who've done this should be familiar, they come in as participants. So I've gone to the front of the room, and I've also logged into Adobe Connect as the facilitator. They log in as participants, which is an automatic default for them. So far, all they've done is sit down, one person logs in, they pop up as a participant with their team name, done. Then, little tips that I remembered is I wanted to record these sessions for the distance students who at this point, if they wanted to, the distance students could have logged in from home as well. So on the distance site, I gave them that information. They had the Adobe Connect meeting, they could have. I'll be honest with you, none of them did. They were too shy, none of them did. But they did listen to the recordings. So it was important that I pressed record in the Adobe Connect meeting, as you would any meeting. And as I learned 2 weeks ago, enable audio. So what I did then is I gave the instructions to everyone. Everyone's just sitting there, and I said, great, everyone's logged in. I've got my audio going, my recording. Here's what we're going to do today. Then I put each of them into their breakout rooms, and here's where it gets a little bit interesting. Okay, so the students now, when they come in, they all show up. They're not in here because I did this later, but they all show up as participants. So now your next job is to put each one of them into the breakout rooms that you created with the help of Nicole's colleagues, and they'll help you set up the breakout rooms. They're pre-done. So all you do is click and drag them, and you pull them each into their individual breakout room, which you can do in Adobe Connect for group work for other reasons, but that's how I did it here. So I click and I drag, and I pulled each one of them into a room. So I had 6 groups. And so each person got pulled into each room. And what happens when you do that is on their individual screen, when I start breakouts, there's a little message up here, little thing here that says start breakouts. So once you've clicked and pulled them each into their room, you click start breakouts, and what happens is each one of their screens now pops up with the room that they've been assigned to. So that's how you divide them into different group work. Okay. So if you wanted to, if you were in a large space, if you wanted to see what was going on in all these rooms, I just physically went around to each station and supported them in their work. But what you can do is you can click and drag yourself as the moderator into each group and see the work that they're doing. So you can do that, as well as each group has a chat. I set it up that they each had an individual chat room. So if they had a question, they can just type in the chat. And if I was the moderator standing at the front, I would see, oh, group 7 has a chat. So this was the work that was done ahead of time. I created, for each breakout room, I created a template of the work that I expected them to do, which none of this is relevant to your teaching. It would be whatever you wanted them to do. This just happens to work for us. And I created what was called a note pod. And just to tie real world learning to what I did here, this acronym is an acronym that paramedics use when they arrive at the hospital and they deliver a patient in the emergency department. It's called I missed AMBO. And it's just a structured way of doing a handover so that the hospital staff get a very good, thorough understanding of what the patient presented with, what their blood pressure was, what medications you gave, important background information. So to me, this was really starting to tie in the things that they're going to be doing in real life with what they're learning at uni. Because at the end of all of this, they had to, or throughout this exercise, they had to create a patient scenario on their own. You get called to a university a uni where a lecturer is doing a presentation and she passes out from anxiety, as an example. Hopefully that doesn't happen today. So they could come up with any scenario that they wanted, and then they would fill in all that information. And even just by working together as a group and filling in that information, that is part of their learning. Because one person in the group would say, well, the blood pressure should be 120 on 80. And someone else should say, no, it should be 80 on 40. Then they get into these discussions. And really, as you know, that's the magic, is those discussions. So anyway, they go through all that, and then because it's a pathophysiology subject, I pre-populated this with whichever disease that I expected them that the patient would have. They got out their books, their iPads, their computers, mostly their phones. They Googled it, they did what they had to do, and they all wrote a description. Their group wrote a description of the pathophysiology. So that was the group work that they did. Once everyone was done, I gave them a time limit, and then I hit record again and said, great. Now we're going to do presentations, which, as you can imagine, they're very nervous about. So how do I do that? Well, what I did was, up here, there's a button that's called End Breakouts. And what that will do is kick them all out of their rooms and bring us all back to the main screen again. So you've sent them away, now you're going to bring them back. The thing is that the very first time we did this, they needed a lot of support. They were nervous, we can't log in, we're not sure who's supposed to do what. So I think I bit off more than I could chew the first time, and I wish I would have done only half as much work. But every time we did it, it got easier and easier. Now they just come in, they sit down, they log in, and they say, hey, where's my group? I can't get in. And so they're used to it. So the first time took the longest. Okay. So when you're done and you end your breakout session, everybody gets directed back to the home page. And that's what gets recorded, is what's ever on the front on the home page. So I then took the microphone and I kind of regrouped and said, okay, here's what we're going to do now, is we're going to actually do a clinical handover. You now have a patient that you've created this whole scenario. So I'm going to be the triage nurse and you're going to give me a handover. So what I did is I took the microphone then and I went to each table individually and I gave them the microphone and said, okay, do your handover. So what the missing piece now is you need to bring up the work that they've been doing as a group. So what you can do is on your home page, if you go into pods and you select breakout pods, you can select any room that you want to project onto the front of the screen. So you can select breakout pods room 1. And so their group work that they've just designed and developed now pops up to the front of the screen. That's what's being recorded. I went to their table and they did their handover. We had a discussion about it, corrections, mistakes, attaboys, that sort of thing. And everyone else had the opportunity to chat. Then I went to the front of the room, moved to number 2, and we went around until it was all done.
All right, so we've got a 72-year-old male that was working in a barn with exposure to mice. Bob.
Remember the ionizer demo is name next page.
Right, so working environment exposure to mice, complaining on arrival, Bob's
Sample and an expanded for you. So the B is the past medical history. So they have any other additional background. Okay, good. So now, ondansetron. Why would they have given him ondansetron?
So that was that. So at the end of it, they have a link on their Interact site called BMS 317 tutorials. My last job is I went in and put the recordings. If they click on it, this is what they get. So they now have a recorded tutorial of every one that we've done. And I've done them a favor, and I've created an Excel spreadsheet, and I've copied and pasted all the patho that they developed, and I've put it into one document. So they now have a study document to use at the end of the year for their final exam. So that was kind of the project that I wanted to create at the end. We just had our last tutorial yesterday, and I used that then as the form, I used that document as a study guide to do a big quiz. We did a big game show where they all had to have their teams, their original teams, and they had to sit in the hot seat and answer questions about that patho. So really, once you've created that, you can use that for anything, and that kind of brought it all together at the end. The other thing I did with this is once you create this and Interact on one of your sites, as you know, you can copy to any site. So I was able to copy it to Bathurst because they didn't do it in this way. They did their tutorials in a more traditional way. So the Bathurst students now have it. And I also was able to give it to the distance students. So once you create this, you just hit copy and you can put it on any Interact site that you have access to. So that was another helpful outcome of that. And pearls and pitfalls. So what went well and what didn't. Now, I've given you the final, yay, look at me, this all worked, but it wasn't without pain and agony. So let's start with the good things. It definitely was a collaborative exercise. That idea of them working together and creating something that was useful and real world applicable, definitely, that worked really well. And the fact that they had to take turns with the microphone giving the handover to the nurse was actually a fantastic opportunity for them to practice what they will be doing in an emergency department. They just did it sitting at a table. So that was an interesting thing to see, is how shy they were. But that's exactly what they're going to be like when they're in the hospital, very shy. So they got better and better and bolder at it. So that was a fun thing to watch develop. So that was their public speaking skills as well. The DE students didn't log in real time, but I've been doing online oral vivas with them to test them. They all get tested on Skype. And it's interesting how many of them bring up the fact that they've been listening to the tutorials and really enjoying that. So that part worked, is that they watched the recordings, which was good. And then we had the study guide at the end.